The beheading of Dirty Dave is a documented history of criminal betrayal and extreme civilian retaliation. Fleeing U.S. authorities after selling out his own gang to save himself, Dave Rudabaugh relocated to Mexico. In 1886, his gambling addiction led him to execute 2 unarmed locals over a lost card game. The civilian response was immediate and brutal. A mob completely disarmed him and severed his head with a machete, impaling it on a pike to parade through the streets. This is the cold, physical reality of frontier mob justice. The blueprint for this gruesome demise was not forged in Mexico. It began in the freezing winter plains of Kansas, where Rudabaugh's specific formula for survival and betrayal was first put to the test. The harsh, unforgiving winter plains of Kansas in late January 1878 provided the frozen stage for the definitive exposure of Dave Rudabaugh's psychological cowardice. The operation he orchestrated was designed to be a highly lucrative, sophisticated strike against the sprawling infrastructure of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. Alongside 2 hardened accomplices, Mike Rourke and Dan DeMint, Rudabaugh targeted a train halted at a remote water station near Kinsley, Kansas. The execution of the robbery, however, completely exposed the vast chasm between Rudabaugh's menacing reputation and his actual logistical competence. Devoid of any masterstroke of outlaw engineering, the raid devolved into a sloppy, chaotic, and ultimately disastrous failure. The gang successfully boarded the train and managed to intimidate the passengers, but they entirely failed to breach the heavy iron safe belonging to the Adams Express Company, which contained the primary financial objective of the raid. Frustrated, freezing, and operating under the rapidly ticking clock of an approaching law enforcement response, the gang was forced to abandon the massive payload. They looted whatever meager cash and pocket watches they could rip from the terrified passengers and fled blindly into the teeth of a brutal, blinding winter blizzard. The physical toll of navigating the Kansas plains during a severe winter storm was catastrophic. The outlaws were exhausted. Their horses were struggling through deep snowdrifts, and their tracks were highly visible in the freshly fallen snow. This desperate retreat allowed the regional authorities to mobilize a heavily armed, highly disciplined posse. The pursuit was organized and led by Ford County Sheriff Bat Masterson, a legitimate battle-tested lawman who possessed an inherent understanding of tracking and tactical engagement. Accompanying Masterson in this posse was a skilled deputy named John Joshua Webb, a man whose life would soon become violently intertwined with Rudabaugh's in a display of supreme historical irony. Masterson's posse did not blindly chase the outlaws through the storm. They methodically tracked them, anticipating their movements and cornering them at a remote, isolated camp. The Hollywood narrative of the American outlaw dictates that a cornered man facing the absolute certainty of a lengthy prison sentence or the hangman's noose will draw his weapons and engage in a glorious, defiant last stand against the authorities. Dave Rudabaugh did not draw a weapon. When Masterson and his heavily armed posse breached the perimeter of the camp, presenting a clear and immediate lethal threat, the fearsome gunfighter instantly surrendered. He raised his hands and submitted to the iron handcuffs without firing a single shot in defense of his freedom or his accomplices. The true depth of his sociopathy, however, was not revealed during the arrest. but in the immediate aftermath within the cold bureaucratic confines of an interrogation room. The moment Rudabaugh recognized the severe legal jeopardy he faced, his internal arithmetic shifted instantly. When cornered by the law, his instinct was absolute self-preservation. He immediately traded the lives of Mike Rourke and Dan DeMint to secure his own amnesty. Without a moment of hesitation or moral conflict, Rudabaugh initiated negotiations with the prosecutors. He formally offered to turn state's evidence. In exchange for total unconditional immunity for his role in the armed robbery, he agreed to provide a full detailed confession and testify in open court against the very men who had ridden beside him into the blizzard. He sat in the witness box, looked his former partners in the eye, and systematically outlined their guilt to the jury. His betrayal was meticulous and legally devastating. Based entirely on Rudabaugh's cooperative testimony, Rourke and DeMint were convicted and heavily sentenced to the grim confines of the state penitentiary. Dave Rudabaugh, having successfully weaponized the judicial system against his own gang, walked out of the courthouse a completely free man. Stripped of any illusion of an honorable rogue fighting a corrupt system, he proved himself a highly adaptable parasite, entirely willing to feed his friends to the state machinery to save his own skin. However, the criminal ecosystem of the 19th century frontier, while violent and chaotic, possessed a long, unforgiving memory. The news of Rudabaugh's courtroom treachery spread rapidly through the underworld network. He was permanently branded as a rat, a deadly informant who could not be trusted in any illicit enterprise. The state of Kansas was no longer a viable operational theater for him. Deprived of criminal associates and constantly looking over his shoulder for retaliatory strikes from friends of the men he had imprisoned, Rudabaugh was forced into a geographic exile. He required an environment where his reputation as a traitor was either unknown or simply overshadowed by a broader culture of systemic, normalized corruption. He found this exact environment by drifting southwest into the territory of New Mexico, specifically targeting the explosive, entirely unregulated railroad boomtown of Las Vegas. Operating entirely outside the rule of law, Las Vegas, New Mexico, in 1879, functioned as a chaotic epicenter of vice-satcher, unregulated capitalism, and extreme violence, fueled by the arrival of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. The town was firmly under the absolute dictatorial control of a corrupt justice of the peace named Hyman G. Neal, colloquially known as Hoodoo Brown. Brown operated a sophisticated criminal syndicate known as the Dodge City Gang, utilizing the municipal police force and the local courts as a state-sanctioned mafia. The gang monopolized the gambling operations, extorted local businesses, and systematically robbed the very stagecoach lines they were supposedly paid to protect. Rudabaugh recognized that this environment perfectly aligned with his predatory nature. He immediately integrated himself into Hoodoo Brown's syndicate. In a display of staggering hypocrisy and opportunism, Rudabaugh forged a close operational partnership with John Joshua Webb, the exact same former deputy who had ridden with Bat Masterson's posse to arrest him in Kansas just a year prior. Webb had abandoned his legitimate law enforcement career, migrating to Las Vegas to serve as a corrupt town marshal and the primary physical enforcer for Hoodoo Brown. The alliance between Rudabaugh and Webb was a master class in civic corruption. Operating under the heavily compromised shield of the local law, the two men engaged in a relentless campaign of extortion and armed robbery. They would utilize their official authority to investigate stagecoach holdups that they themselves had planned and executed, ensuring that the stolen payloads were securely funneled back into the Dodge City gang's coffers and the investigations permanently stalled. Rudabaugh had effectively discovered a way to be an outlaw while simultaneously hiding behind a badge, a perfect scenario for a man who preferred his violence to carry zero legal risk. This highly lucrative state-sponsored extortion racket operated smoothly until the political and social climate of Las Vegas violently fractured in the spring of 1880. The catalyst for the collapse was a moment of uncalculated violence by J.J. Webb. During a confrontation in a local saloon, Webb shot and killed an individual named Michael Kelleher. While Webb and the Dodge City gang attempted to frame the murder as a justified police action, the citizens of Las Vegas had finally reached their absolute threshold for the syndicate's brutality. A massive public outcry demanded accountability, forcing the territorial authorities to intervene. The corrupt infrastructure failed to protect Webb. He was formally arrested, tried, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to hang. The impending execution of Webb represented a catastrophic tactical crisis for Dave Rudabaugh. Webb was his primary ally, his strongest connection to the remnants of the civic power structure, and his physical backup in a town that was rapidly turning hostile. Furthermore, Rudabaugh understood that a man facing the gallows might very well adopt Rudabaugh's own survival methodology and begin trading secrets to the state in exchange for a commuted sentence. Driven by extreme paranoia and the desperate need to secure his own safety, Rudabaugh orchestrated a direct, violent assault on the judicial apparatus. In early April 1880, Rudabaugh and an accomplice named John Allen breached the perimeter of the San Miguel County Jail, intent on breaking Webb out of his cell before he could be executed or interrogated. The jail was a dark, heavily fortified stone structure designed to withstand external assaults. As the two men navigated the narrow corridors, they were confronted by the night jailer, a man named Antonio Lino Valdez. Valdez was an ordinary citizen performing a dangerous civic duty. Instead of a legendary gunfighter, Valdez was simply a dedicated guard holding a set of iron keys. When Rudabaugh demanded the keys to Webb's cell, Valdez bravely but fatally refused to comply. The situation demanded an immediate, tactical resolution. In the dark, confined space of the stone corridor, Rudabaugh bypassed any threat or negotiation. He raised his revolver and fired at point-blank range, offering Valdez no chance to draw a weapon or defend himself. The heavy lead bullet struck Valdez directly, tearing through his body and killing him instantly. The deafening acoustic shock of the gunshot echoed through the jail, instantly alerting the surrounding town to the breach. Lacking the mechanics of a mutual shootout, this act manifested strictly as the cowardly, premeditated assassination of an unarmed civil servant. The murder of Antonio Valdez completely destroyed the objective of the mission. The sudden escalation of lethal violence and the rapidly approaching response from the townspeople caused Rudabaugh and Allen to panic. Despite having murdered the guard, they were entirely unable to locate or operate the specific keys required to open the heavy iron door of Webb's cell. Their assault was a complete tactical failure. Leaving Valdez's bleeding corpse on the cold stone floor, Rudabaugh abandoned his incarcerated partner and executed a frantic, desperate retreat into the darkness. He fled Las Vegas on horseback, riding blindly into the surrounding desert. The execution of the jailer marked a point of absolute, irreversible no return. Rudabaugh had crossed the final threshold. He was no longer just a rat who betrayed his friends or a corrupt deputy extorting gamblers. He was a cop killer, a highly dangerous fugitive actively hunted by furious posses, territorial marshals, and heavily armed citizen militias. The murder of Valdez stripped away the last remaining shreds of his political protection and his civic camouflage. He had intentionally burned every bridge, betrayed every alliance, and murdered the innocent to preserve his own life. Forced into the unforgiving wilderness of the Southwest, hunted by every faction of society, Dave Rudabaugh began his final decaying descent. He was transforming into a feral, hyper-paranoid predator, surviving on stolen beef and cheap liquor, completely unaware that his path was inexorably leading him toward a dusty courtyard in Mexico, where his life of calculated treachery would be terminated not by the law, but by the raw butchering mechanics of a machete. The immediate geographical reality of fleeing Las Vegas, New Mexico, in the dead of night following the murder of a law enforcement officer, was not a thrilling equestrian adventure. It was a grueling physiological nightmare, defined by extreme temperature fluctuations, absolute geographical isolation, and the terrifying biological limitations of both horse and rider. Dave Rudabaugh rode blindly into the high desert, plunging into an unforgiving environment that systematically strips away the veneer of human civilization. The Hollywood depiction of the outlaw on the run typically involves scenic campfires and quiet reflection under a canopy of stars. The forensic reality of Rudabaugh's existence was a squalid, hyper-paranoid exercise in bare survival. He was now a high-value target, actively hunted by organized posses, territorial marshals, and bounty hunters who possessed intimate knowledge of the local topography. He could no longer rely on the criminal networks he had previously betrayed, nor could he seek shelter in established municipalities. He was forced into the arroyos, the deep canyons, and the barren scrubland, initiating a feral existence that would rapidly degrade his physical and psychological architecture. It was during this period of extreme geographic isolation that the moniker Dirty Dave solidified its absolute accuracy. Historical accounts frequently attribute this nickname to a severe, localized lack of personal hygiene, noting that Rudabaugh rarely bathed and wore the same sweat-stained clothing for months at a time. However, reducing the nickname to mere physical filth fundamentally misunderstands the man's pathology. The dirt on Rudabaugh's skin was merely a biological manifestation of his internal operating procedure. He lived dirty, he fought dirty, and he survived through dirty tactics. The accumulation of desert dust, horse sweat, and dried blood on his clothing was the physical uniform of a man completely severed from the social contract. In the absence of infrastructure, basic sanitation is abandoned in favor of constant movement. Washing requires a stable water source, and a stable water source is the exact location where law enforcement posses lay ambushes. Therefore, Rudabaugh actively avoided the vulnerability of cleanliness. He allowed his physical form to deteriorate, his unwashed state serving as a repulsive physical barrier that matched his malignant personality. He became a walking biological hazard, a man whose physical presence was as toxic and unpleasant as his reputation for betrayal. Surviving in this hostile terrain required a massive, constant intake of calories, presenting a severe logistical crisis for a solitary fugitive. Rudabaugh could not purchase provisions at a general store. He was forced to become a parasitic scavenger, relying entirely on the opportunistic rustling of stray cattle or the theft of supplies from isolated homesteads. The culinary reality of the 19th century fugitive was brutal and entirely devoid of comfort. When Rudabaugh managed to kill a stolen steer in a remote, rocky ravine, the butchering process was a frantic, bloody race against time and temperature. Without refrigeration, the massive yield of raw muscle tissue would rapidly enter the initial stages of putrefaction beneath the blistering desert sun. To arrest this biological decay, the meat had to be heavily and aggressively packed in coarse salt, extracting the moisture to create a tough, virtually inedible jerky. When he possessed the luxury of actually cooking the meat, the process required severe tactical discipline. An open campfire produces a highly visible column of gray smoke, functioning as a massive geographic beacon for any pursuing posse within a 20-mile radius. To circumvent this fatal error, Rudabaugh utilized the essential heavy piece of equipment carried by every successful fugitive, the cast-iron Dutch oven. The methodology was rooted in concealment. He would dig a deep hole in the dry earth, build a small, intensely hot fire utilizing dry mesquite wood, which produces minimal smoke, and allow the fuel to reduce entirely to glowing white-hot coals. The heavy cast-iron pot, loaded with tough, heavily salted beef and whatever scavenged roots or beans he possessed, was lowered into the pit and completely buried beneath the earth and the hot coals. This subterranean cooking method effectively smothered all light and smoke, utilizing radiant heat to slowly break down the tough connective tissue of the meat over several hours. The resulting meals were not consumed with any sense of satisfaction. Eating was a strictly mechanical process of caloric intake executed under a state of suffocating paranoia. Rudabaugh consumed this heavy, salt-laden food while sitting in the dirt, his weapons drawn and resting on his lap, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines for movement, his ears straining to isolate the sound of approaching hooves over the howling of the desert wind. The gastrointestinal toll of this survival diet, high in sodium, low in essential nutrients, and frequently contaminated by the unsanitary conditions of the camp, further eroded his physical stamina. He was perpetually dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from the cumulative effects of sleep deprivation. The human brain is fundamentally not wired to sustain a state of maximum, uninterrupted hypervigilance. The constant flood of cortisol and adrenaline required to remain alert to lethal threats slowly poisons the nervous system, leading to severe cognitive fatigue, irrational decision-making, and profound auditory and visual hallucinations. To forcefully self-medicate this crushing psychological pressure and quiet the unrelenting paranoia, Rudabaugh turned to heavy, systematic substance abuse. Alcohol became an operational necessity, a chemical mechanism utilized to forcefully shut down his exhausted nervous system and allow him to achieve brief periods of unconsciousness. He did not consume finely aged spirits. He relied on cheap, volatile rot-gut whiskey, and as he drifted further south, harsh, unrefined mezcal and tequila. These highly concentrated alcohols provided immediate central nervous system depression, temporarily muting his fear, but they simultaneously exacerbated his inherent volatility. The chronic consumption of low-quality alcohol severely degraded his frontal lobe function, entirely stripping away his impulse control and tactical reasoning. When intoxicated, the calculated, cunning traitor devolved into a blind, reactionary animal, highly prone to explosive outbursts of unprovoked violence. He was a heavily armed, severely compromised addict, wandering the desert, a ticking biological bomb lacking any internal safety mechanism. The desperate need for capital to fund his survival and his alcohol dependency forced him to occasionally risk entering marginalized settlements and mining camps. Deprived of a gang to execute large-scale robberies, Rudabaugh reverted to the grift. He utilized the card tables as his primary hunting ground. His approach to gambling was identical to his approach to human relationships. It was entirely predicated on deception. Rudabaugh was a notorious card cheat. He operated in the squalid, smoke-filled back rooms of cantinas, utilizing marked decks, bottom dealing, and sophisticated sleight-of-hand techniques to separate exhausted miners and transient laborers from their wages. However, cheating in unregulated frontier saloons carried a massive, immediate mortality risk. When his deceptions were inevitably discovered by the men sitting across the table, Rudabaugh did not attempt to de-escalate or deny the accusations. He utilized his intimidating physical presence and his speed with a revolver to violently enforce his theft. He would simply draw his weapon, collect the illicit winnings from the center of the table, and back out of the saloon, leaving a trail of furious, victimized men in his wake. This endless cycle of petty theft and immediate localized violence ensured that his operational lifespan in any given territory was measured in days, not months. During this frantic period of geographic displacement, Rudabaugh's path briefly intersected with another apex predator of the New Mexico territory, Billy the Kid. The brief alliance between Rudabaugh and the Kid's faction was not built on mutual respect. It was a temporary, highly tense convergence of convenience. Billy the Kid possessed a vast network of sympathizers and safe houses, resources that the isolated Rudabaugh desperately required. However, historical documentation from the era indicates a profound underlying tension between the two men. Billy the Kid, despite his own lethal reputation, recognized the sheer unpredictable malignancy of Rudabaugh's pathology. The Kid understood that a man who had already sold out multiple gangs to the authorities was a severe tactical liability. Rudabaugh was essentially a rabid dog allowed into the camp. He was useful for his raw capacity for violence during a firefight, but he required constant paranoid monitoring to ensure he did not turn his teeth on his own allies. This fragile, toxic alliance inevitably collapsed under the pressure of a massive law enforcement dragnet. In December 1880, a highly disciplined posse led by Sheriff Pat Garrett tracked the gang to a remote, freezing stone structure at Stinking Springs. Following a brief, intense siege that resulted in the death of a gang member, the Outlaws, recognizing their tactically hopeless position, surrendered to Garrett. Rudabaugh was once again in iron shackles, facing the absolute certainty of the gallows for the murder of the Las Vegas jailer. He was transported via rail back toward the jurisdiction where his crimes were most heavily concentrated, surrounded by heavily armed guards. Yet, the universe frequently allows the most malignant elements to slip through the cracks of the institutional machinery. In an astonishing display of structural incompetence by the territorial authorities, Rudabaugh managed to execute a highly improbable escape from the Las Vegas jail, utilizing smuggled tools and exploiting the sheer negligence of his captors. He breached the stone walls and vanished into the night. He understood with absolute clarity that his luck within the borders of the United States had completely expired. The telegraph wires were active, the bounties on his head were astronomical, and Pat Garrett's posses were relentless. The American Southwest was a closed trap. To survive, Rudabaugh was forced to execute a permanent geographic severing. He turned his horse south, pushing hard toward the porous, largely unmonitored border of Mexico. He crossed the Rio Grande, leaving the jurisdiction of the United States Marshals behind, entering the vast arid expanse of the Mexican state of Chihuahua. He believed he had successfully outrun his past, utilizing the international border as an impenetrable shield against the consequences of his treachery. He assumed that the Mexican interior would provide a chaotic, unregulated sanctuary where he could continue his parasitic lifestyle with impunity. What Dave Rudabaugh fundamentally failed to comprehend was that he was not entering a lawless void. He was entering a highly complex, fiercely proud cultural ecosystem that possessed its own brutal, immediate mechanisms for dealing with violent, predatory outsiders. He brought his dirt, his paranoia, his cheap tequila, and his profound arrogance into a foreign town called Parral, setting the stage for a catastrophic clash between his own cowardly reliance on firearms and the overwhelming raw kinetic power of collective civilian rage. The migration of Dave Rudabaugh into the interior of Chihuahua, Mexico, in the winter of 1886 was predicated on a massive, fatal cultural miscalculation. He viewed the international border not merely as a legal barrier against American marshals, but as a gateway into a supposedly primitive, unregulated sandbox where his specific brand of armed intimidation could be exercised with absolute impunity. He arrived in the bustling mining center of Parral, operating under the profoundly arrogant assumption that the local Mexican population would react to his violence with the same paralyzing, disorganized fear he had successfully cultivated among the transient miners of the American Southwest. This assumption completely ignored the deeply entrenched sociology of the region. Parral was a community bound by strong localized loyalties and a fierce historical intolerance for violent American drifters who attempted to export their lawlessness across the Rio Grande. Rudabaugh did not recognize that he had entered an environment where his reputation as a deadly gunfighter held absolutely zero currency. He was no longer a feared outlaw legend. He was simply an abrasive, heavily intoxicated foreigner who represented a direct threat to the civic stability of the town. Rudabaugh's physical and psychological condition upon establishing himself in Parral was critically degraded. Years of feral survival, constant geographic displacement, and profound sleep deprivation had severely compromised his cognitive function. The severe chemical dependency forged during his desert exile had now reached a terminal velocity. Completely surrendering to his addiction to numb the relentless paranoia of an international fugitive, his remaining cognitive functions were heavily suppressed. The cunning, calculating traitor who had once successfully manipulated federal prosecutors had fully devolved into a sloppy, highly reactive addict. He spent his days loitering in the dimly lit, smoke-filled cantinas of Parral, attempting to fund this squalid existence by falling back on his only remaining skill set, cheating at the card tables. It was a squalid, high-risk existence that required a level of sharp observation and steady nerves that Rudabaugh no longer possessed. The fatal detonation of this volatile mixture occurred on February 18, 1886. The environment was a crowded, noisy cantina, the air thick with the smell of stale liquor, sweat, and cigar smoke. Rudabaugh was deeply engaged in a card game, his cognitive abilities severely blunted by heavy intoxication. Inevitably, the mechanical execution of his card cheating failed. When a local patron recognized the deception and aggressively confronted the American, Rudabaugh completely bypassed any attempt at verbal de-escalation. Operating entirely on the primitive, lethal instinct that had defined his entire adult life, he resorted to immediate, maximum violence. He drew his heavy-caliber revolver and fired directly into the confined space of the cantina. The heavy lead bullets struck two local men, instantly inflicting catastrophic, fatal trauma. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the deafening gunshots, as the victims collapsed to the floor and the surrounding patrons recoiled in shock, Rudabaugh holstered his weapon. His alcohol-soaked brain registered a false sense of absolute dominance. He believed that the sudden application of lethal force had successfully terrified the room, allowing him to simply collect his money, walk out the front door, and ride away into the desert, repeating the exact same escape methodology he had utilized in Las Vegas. He stepped out of the dark cantina and into the blinding, harsh Mexican sunlight, the adrenaline heavily surging through his cardiovascular system. It was at this precise, critical moment that Rudabaugh realized he had committed the most catastrophic, fundamental logistical error possible for a mounted fugitive. In his drunken haste prior to entering the saloon, or due to sheer staggering negligence, he had failed to properly secure his horse. The animal was gone. It had either broken its tether during the gunfire or simply wandered off into the labyrinthine alleys of the town. The physical reality of his situation crashed down upon him. The horse was the absolute non-negotiable core of the 19th century outlaw's survival strategy. It was the sole mechanism for geographic displacement. Without his mount, Rudabaugh's entire tactical framework instantly collapsed. He was rendered completely immobile, a heavy, uncoordinated man weighed down by firearms, standing entirely exposed in the center of a dusty street, trapped deep inside a foreign municipality. The citizens of Parral did not react to the gunshots with the passive, scattering fear that Rudabaugh had anticipated. They did not wait for a local magistrate to issue an arrest warrant, nor did they attempt to organize a formal deputized posse. The response to the unprovoked murder of two community members was instantaneous, organic, and overwhelmingly violent. The townspeople poured out of the surrounding businesses, homes, and alleyways, forming a massive, furious mob that rapidly converged on the stranded American. The mathematical reality of the frontier dictated that a single gunfighter, regardless of his speed or accuracy, cannot suppress a swarm of dozens of highly motivated, enraged individuals converging from a 360-degree radius. Rudabaugh's revolver, the instrument that had dictated his power for a decade, was rendered completely useless against the sheer, crushing kinetic mass of the crowd. He was quickly overwhelmed, physically tackled to the dirt, and violently disarmed. The mob dragged the thrashing, desperate outlaw back toward the plaza, stripping away every ounce of his manufactured, intimidating aura. He was no longer the terror of the New Mexico territory. He was a terrified, helpless animal caught in a trap of his own making. The community of Parral did not seek to place him in a jail cell for a prolonged, bureaucratic trial. They sought immediate, permanent, and highly visible retribution. The execution that followed was not a clean, clinical application of state justice. It was a raw, visceral, and horrifyingly brutal physical process. Someone within the furious crowd produced a heavy, broad-bladed agricultural machete. To completely sever a human head from the torso is a biomechanically complex and physically demanding task. It requires immense kinetic energy, a razor-sharp, heavy blade, and a completely stationary target. The mob in Parral possessed none of the engineered precision of a French guillotine. The execution was a chaotic, hacking butchery. The heavy steel blade was brought down repeatedly upon the back of Rudabaugh's neck. The initial strikes tore violently through his neck, shattering bone and severing his spine. The sheer physical effort required to hack through the muscle tissue reduced the execution to a frantic, bloody struggle in the dust. The courtyard was left heavily coated in the aftermath of the slaughter, permanently concluding the life of a man who had built his entire existence on avoiding a fair fight. The mob did not stop at the physical termination of his life. The execution was heavily imbued with a deep symbolic purpose, to ensure that the visual warning was permanently etched into the landscape. The citizens of Parral retrieved the severed, blood-soaked head of Dave Rudabaugh. They impaled the ragged base of the neck upon a sharpened wooden pole and hoisted it high into the air. They paraded this gruesome, dripping artifact through the dusty streets of the town, an undeniable, visceral demonstration of their absolute refusal to be victimized by foreign predators. The head was eventually planted firmly in the center of the courtyard, left entirely exposed to the blistering Mexican sun and the carrion insects. As the days passed, the flesh rapidly began to desiccate, the skin pulling tight against the skull, the features rotting away to leave a pallid, horrifying death mask. This was the ultimate calculated degradation. The citizens of Parral systematically stripped Dave Rudabaugh of everything: his weapons, his mobility, his life, and finally, his physical dignity. The man who had betrayed his friends to avoid the gallows in Kansas, who had murdered an unarmed jailer to escape a cell in New Mexico, had finally run out of leverage. He could not negotiate with a machete. The head on the pole served as a permanent forensic testament to the absolute failure of his survival methodology, a stark, rotting monument to the reality that a life built entirely on treachery and cowardly violence will inevitably end in absolute, unmitigated slaughter. That same chilling visual artifact extracted from the Mexican courtyard did not merely serve as a morbid regional curiosity. It rapidly evolved into a crucial, heavily scrutinized forensic document that would haunt the historical archives of the American West for over a century. The haunting image, carefully developed and transported across the border, was initially circulated among the law enforcement networks of Texas and New Mexico as definitive biological proof that the plague of Dave Rudabaugh had finally been eradicated. For the sheriffs, the bounty hunters, and the surviving victims of his extortion rackets, the image of the severed head mounted on the wooden pole provided a grim, undeniable closure. It was the physical receipt for a life defined by unmitigated treachery. However, as the photograph was disseminated and examined more closely by individuals who had intimately known Rudabaugh during his reign of terror, a profound and deeply unsettling discrepancy began to emerge. The visual evidence presented in the photograph initiated a complex historical and genetic mystery that fundamentally challenged the official narrative of the Parral massacre. The core of this enduring historical dispute rests entirely upon a glaring paradox of age and cranial morphology. The biographical ledger dictates that Dave Rudabaugh was born in Illinois in July of 1854. Therefore, on the afternoon of February 18, 1886, when the machete severed his spinal cord, he was merely 31 years old. He was a man in the absolute chronological prime of his life. Yet a meticulous, high-resolution visual analysis of the head impaled upon the pole presents a drastically different biological profile. The face staring blindly toward the camera appears to belong to a man who is significantly older, possessing the heavily weathered, deeply creased features of an individual well into his 5th or 6th decade of life. The skin hangs loosely around the jawline. The hairline appears substantially receded, and the overall bone structure presents a wider, heavier appearance than earlier, confirmed descriptions of the outlaw. Rationalizing this visual paradox requires forensic historians and taphonomy experts to engage in a complex biological calculus. It is an established medical reality that the immediate post-mortem environment can drastically alter the physical appearance of human remains. The head in Parral was subjected to extreme environmental trauma. The blistering, unyielding ultraviolet radiation of the Chihuahua sun would induce rapid, severe dehydration of the epidermal layers, a process known as mummification or desiccation. As the moisture is violently extracted from the tissue, the skin shrinks, pulling tightly across the underlying bone structure, instantly creating deep artificial wrinkles and hollowing out the cheeks and orbital cavities. Furthermore, the sheer catastrophic shock of the decapitation itself, the sudden massive drop in blood pressure, and the violent severing of the facial nerves can cause the facial muscles to collapse and distort heavily. However, even factoring in the extreme variables of post-mortem desiccation and the brutal mechanics of the execution, many researchers maintain that the degree of aging visible in the Outlaw photograph transcends the boundaries of biological degradation. The structural discrepancies have fueled a persistent, highly resilient conspiracy theory, suggesting that Dave Rudabaugh, employing the exact same cowardly, self-preserving methodology that had defined his entire criminal career, managed to escape the cantina brawl entirely unharmed. The theory posits a scenario deeply rooted in his established pathology. When the gunfire erupted and the furious mob began to swarm the establishment, Rudabaugh recognized that his physical domination of the environment had failed. Instead of standing his ground, he utilized the chaotic, smoke-filled confusion of the saloon to execute a desperate, unseen retreat. According to this narrative, an unlucky proxy, perhaps an unfortunate associate, a fellow intoxicated American drifter, or simply a man who bore a passing resemblance to the outlaw, was caught in the immediate crossfire and subsequently dragged into the street by the blinded, enraged mob. The townspeople of Parral, driven by a primal need for immediate collective vengeance and largely unfamiliar with Rudabaugh's precise facial geometry, butchered the wrong man. They hacked the head from an innocent or a lesser criminal, hoisted it upon the pole, and proudly displayed it as a monument to their civic defense, completely unaware that the true architect of the violence was already miles away, riding hard toward the northern mountains under the cover of darkness. The psychological appeal of this survival myth is deeply embedded in the public's fascination with the archetype of the invincible trickster. There is a dark, cynical desire to believe that the ultimate betrayer, the man who consistently outmaneuvered the judicial system and sold out his closest allies, possessed the cunning required to cheat death itself. The rumors of his survival did not simply vanish into the desert air. They crystallized into a specific geographical narrative. Whispers circulated through the underworld networks that Rudabaugh had successfully navigated the treacherous mountain passes of Sonora, slipped completely undetected across the heavily patrolled Arizona border, and initiated a massive permanent migration north. The theory dictates that he traveled up the rugged spine of the continent, eventually seeking sanctuary in the dense, isolated timberlands of the Pacific Northwest. For decades, unverified reports and localized folklore placed an aging Dave Rudabaugh living a quiet, heavily guarded existence under an assumed identity in the remote, rain-soaked valleys of Oregon or the sprawling cattle ranches of Montana. The narrative concludes with a final, ironic twist. The man who had lived his youth bathed in blood and treachery purportedly died a peaceful, natural death of old age in 1928, passing away quietly in a warm bed, surrounded by a family entirely ignorant of his horrific past, supposedly whispering his true identity only in his final, dying breath. Modern historical investigation frequently attempts to validate or dismantle these century-old ghost stories, searching for definitive closure. However, any pursuit of modern scientific certainty regarding Dave Rudabaugh immediately collides with a catastrophic historical roadblock. The severed head photographed by Outlaw does not reside in a climate-controlled museum archive or a sterile laboratory awaiting forensic scrutiny. Following its gruesome exhibition in the Mexican courtyard, the biological artifact was left completely to the mercy of the elements. It was baked by the unforgiving Chihuahua sun, scavenged by feral dogs and carrion birds, and ultimately reduced to scattered dust. This brutal environmental erasure obliterated the only piece of physical evidence capable of permanently closing the ledger. There is no skull to analyze, no marked grave to exhume, and no physical anchor to definitively silence the rumors. The mystery of Parral remains locked in an unresolvable stalemate, leaving the historical record permanently suspended between the stark visual probability of a brutal execution and the lingering cynical folklore of a successful escape. Yet when one applies a cold, objective analysis to the totality of Dave Rudabaugh's existence, the resolution of this specific genetic mystery becomes profoundly irrelevant. The ultimate verdict on his life is not determined by identifying the specific biological mass mounted on the pole. It is determined by the inescapable, crushing weight of his operational legacy. If the man hacked to pieces in the dusty street of Parral was indeed Dave Rudabaugh, it was the mathematically certain conclusion to a life defined by predatory betrayal. He manipulated the law, he sold his accomplices to the hangman, and he murdered the unarmed, operating under the arrogant assumption that his ruthlessness granted him immunity from the consequences of his actions. But the frontier is a closed ecosystem, and it eventually demands a violent balancing of the ledger. He found himself trapped, disarmed, and surrounded by a community that did not recognize his reputation or fear his name, dying a squalid, terrifying death in the dirt. Conversely, if the conspiracy theory holds true, and Rudabaugh successfully orchestrated the ultimate deception by allowing an innocent man to be butchered in his place while he fled to the Pacific Northwest, the moral and historical verdict remains identical. A man who survives by shedding his identity, abandoning his name, and hiding in the perpetual shadows of the Oregon timberlands is not a victorious outlaw. He is a coward, condemned to a self-imposed psychological prison. He spent the remaining 4 decades of his life existing in a state of absolute, suffocating paranoia, jumping at every knock on the door, terrified that the ghosts of Kinsley, Las Vegas, and Parral had finally tracked him down. He surrendered his power, his reputation, and his entire existence, living out his days as a terrified ghost. Dave Rudabaugh serves as the ultimate historical indictment of the romanticized American West. He was the antithesis of the honorable frontiersman, a predator who fed on the trust of his associates and weaponized the legal system for his own survival. The image of the severed head in the Mexican courtyard functions as the perfect, enduring monument to his legacy. It stands as a permanent warning. Those who navigate the world, relying strictly upon treachery and cowardly violence, will inevitably find themselves entirely isolated, facing a brutal conclusion stripped of all romance, all dignity, and all mercy.